Hello, it's Bill Berry, producing artistic director here at the Fifth Avenue Theater in Seattle. We are so excited because today we have a special guest who's going to join me in a moment, who has had a long, illustrious, amazing career in theater, in musical theater specifically, but also in film and television, Academy Awards, Tony Awards, Laurence Olivier Awards, Grammy Awards, you name it, he's won those awards. It is the amazing, talented lyricist, Sir Tim Rice. It is so delightful to have you here to talk to us about Beauty and the Beast and about your career as a lyricist. Thank you for taking time today to do that. It's just an honor to have you here.
Well, it's a great pleasure to be, even though only by Zoom, in Seattle, where I hope to come back in the flesh before too long.
We are so excited. As you know, our first production back after this pandemic will be Beauty and the Beast. I think it's a great beginning, rebirth after the pandemic to start with Beauty and the Beast. But I'm curious if you could, before we talk about that, could you share a little bit about how you became a lyricist? I think people might be curious. That's one of those jobs in the theater that I think people are like, now, how do you become that?
Well, it certainly wasn't a deliberate career move. I was lucky enough to meet Andrew Lloyd Webber when I was very young. And I think Andrew was one of those rare beasts who absolutely knew what he was going to do. And that was right for musical theatre. And he really was a musician. Well, he is a musician. And he didn't have anybody to write words for him. And I was aware of a lot of musical shows, but mainly through albums. My parents had a great LP collection, long players for younger listeners, or 33 revs per minute. And I knew the scores of lots of shows, but I didn't live in London as a kid. And when I met Andrew in 1965, I was 20 and he was 17. And he'd seen virtually every show that had been in the West End for the previous 4 or 5 years, since he was about 10 almost, whereas I'd not really seen any. I'd seen My Fair Lady, which was my favorite musical, but I was rather strange. I was a vinyl junkie. I loved records, and I loved the covers and the artwork and the sleeves, and of course I loved the music that was on the records. And that went for my main record collection of my own, which not my parents, was Elvis and the Everly Brothers and Chuck Berry and Eddie Cochran and Little Richard. Nearly all American, great rock and roll artists. But I did love the King and I and Sound of Music, and actually that was a bit later, but King and I, West Side Story, South Pacific, Oklahoma, My Fair Lady, of course, Gigi, all these great shows. And I knew the scores very well. And I knew Oliver, which was the great British hit musical of the time. And when I met Andrew, I'd written a couple of pop songs, which were a bit sort of sub-Dylan, sub-Donovan. And they were, they weren't terrible, but one of them got recorded by a group whose career, frankly, was my song. I think I finished their career off. But I had this record in my hand as a sort of calling card, and I used to hawk it around to people in the faint hope of getting a job in the music business or getting a commission to write. And a book publisher, funnily enough, was the bloke who gave me a break, in as much as he said, well, I'm not really in the music business, but I do know a young man who is. Andrew Lloyd Webber is his name. And I thought he'll have to change his name if he's going to make it. Maybe you should meet him if you've written a few songs and he wants to write for the theatre. So I went around and met Andrew, and we got on very well. And it was clear that it's clear to me that he was going to make it. And I think he believed it himself, which is great self-confidence. And when he invited me to put some words onto a musical he'd written about Dr. Bernardo, the Victorian philanthropist, I gave it a go. And although I was pursuing a law career at the time, it was great fun doing that in my spare time. And it worked. It told us that we could write together well, although the show that we began on didn't go anywhere. It wasn't good enough. And it was the story, I think, that wasn't quite strong enough. And of course, I guess most of the songs weren't world class, but the music was good. And one or two of the lyrics were okay. The funny ones were better. And when that didn't work, we came down in our ambitions a bit and wrote something for a school. And that turned out to be Joseph and His Amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat. And that was the one that slowly got us off, because through schools it became more and more popular. And then that got us a recording deal to make a record of Joseph. which didn't do particularly well, but it got us an agent and a manager. And that in turn got us a deal to do something else. And the something else turned out to be Jesus Christ Superstar. So suddenly we were writing and we had an outlet for it. But the outlet was not the theatre originally, although we wanted to write for theatre. Joseph escaped through schools and Superstar escaped through an album. So I did end up being a theatre lyricist, but it was a bit of a roundabout route.
So Beauty and the Beast, a giant hit film back in 1991, right? Yes.
Yeah.
And then a big Broadway hit, 1994, if I have my date right, and ran for 13 years. I'm curious, why do you think this is such an appealing story? And I think every time a theater does it's a big success. People love coming to it. There was just another UK version of it, I believe, that toured or is about to tour.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. Why do you think this is such a perennial?
Well, I can stand back a bit from it because, as I'm sure people know, I was not involved, unfortunately for me, in the original film because the brilliant lyricist Howard Ashman wrote the lyrics for the 5 or 6 songs in the original Disney animated feature. And Howard was brilliant. And I came along to Disney a little bit after Beauty and the Beast. It had just been released as a movie, and it was part of the great Disney revival of their animation, which began really with Little Mermaid, which again was Howard Ashman and Alan Menken. Then came Beauty and the Beast, Howard and Alan. Then came Aladdin, which when I came to Disney to work on what became The Lion King, Aladdin was in the process of being shot and being worked on and still being written. And the tragedy was, of course, that Howard died during the making of Aladdin and he was unable to finish. And I was working with the Disney team, not always the same guys who were on Aladdin, but there was a bit of an overlap. And I must have passed some sort of imaginary audition because they said, well, do you think, in fact, I was told, forget about Lion King for 2 months or however long, get on to Aladdin. And I hadn't even met Alan Menken. I was a great fan of his. And I was put onto Aladdin and it worked well. I was able to, I was very nervous following in Howard's footsteps, but it worked out well. And when it came to Beauty and the Beast being turned into a stage show, I got the job again because Alan and I had got on very well. We become good friends. We still are good friends. And I was very honored, still a bit nervous, to write, in fact, 5 or 6 more songs for Beauty. And I wrote another 2 or 3 for the more recent live action movie. So, and the key thing about Beauty, apart from the fact that it was a cracking good story, is that it was the first time Disney went into theatre in that way. Yeah. So I was very much in at the beginning of Disney theatricals. And in answer to your original question, why does Beauty work so well? It is all down, I think, largely to the story. I think if people ask me, how do you write a hit musical? The answer is, I haven't a clue. But I would say the key thing is to remember that nobody knows anything, and you might be right with your wacky ideas. But the key thing, once you get going, you've got to have a good story. Without a good story, often the best score can collapse. I mean, you think of, there's been a musical based on Sergeant Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. Well, you couldn't get a better score than that. But there's no storyline. There was never meant to be one. This isn't a criticism of Sergeant Pepper. It was brilliant. But it's almost impossible to make something like that into a musical. And it has worked occasionally with Mamma Mia, but Mamma Mia worked brilliantly. But that was a good story. They got a great story for those ABBA songs. And Beauty is one of the great stories of all time. It's a wonderful fairy tale. It's a story of, redemption and bad people turning or, learning the folly of their ways. Well, it doesn't preach. It's just a true life story, even though it's obviously fictional, because sad to say, in real life, there are not fairies and people don't turn into physical beasts and all that. But that's not the point. I think children and adults, if you like, children of all ages, get that it's an allegory. And it's a very inspiring story to work for because you've got so many characters. You've got the bad guy, you've got Gaston, you've got the comedy there as well. You've got the Beast, who is a tragic figure. And you've got Belle, who is a romantic hero. And even she has doubts at times. So it's all there. And the cartoon, the animated feature, I should say, because Disney don't like me to say it so much. but it was a cartoon. I love cartoons. The cartoon, the animated feature, captured all that superbly. But for theatre, it's got to be a bit longer. It can't just be, a few songs and this, that, and the other. And it was a challenge, but especially, as I said, with the shadow of the great Howard hanging over all the time. But I think Howard would have approved of what we did. And I never forget the contribution he made to the show of beauty, even though he never knew about the show of beauty.
Well, I have one final question to sort of ask. What inspires you? Where do you find inspiration as a lyricist, as a storyteller? I just love asking people who create, what's their inspiration?
Well, I think in my case, it's been getting back to, the story again. I think it's the choice of the stories. I mean, the story of Joseph was my favorite Bible story as a child. And I thought, well, if it appealed to me and we're writing something not aimed at, but for school children of all ages. I loved Joseph when I was 10. Why, perhaps people 20 years later would love it, or in my case then, 10 years later. And Superstar, I was brought up at one or two very religious schools in the Christian tradition, but I don't think Superstar, I hope anyway, because it's been very successful in many non-Christian countries. It's a great story of sacrifice and good and evil or good and misunderstanding. And Eva Peron, which nobody knew much about, at least in England or even in America. Nobody knew a lot about Eva Peron. That's a good story. It's a wonderful Cinderella story. And that's been my inspiration. And funnily enough, those stories which got me going, and indeed The Lion King, they all had links with my childhood. In one way or another. Eva Peron, believe it or not, I knew about through my stamp collection when I was a kid. The Argentine stamps had Eva Peron on, which was slightly unusual to have somebody who didn't appear to be A, a bloke, and B, a sort of, strange, all-powerful looking figure. There was just this rather very attractive silhouette of a woman on the Argentine stamps, and I always remembered that. And I didn't know much more about her until I heard a radio program about her in 1973, and I thought, this is an interesting character. I want to know more because I remembered her from when I was 7 or 8. Mm-hmm. And so I think my inspiration in many respects is what happened to me in my childhood. And I think that is true for so many people, even if they don't realize it. It's what happens to you, what you learn about, what you think about from the age of 0 to 12 is probably a bigger influence on you than any other period in your life. You may not think that, but it's true.
I'm gonna go and consider that for the rest of the day and be like, how did I end up here? Where were those influences?
Well, I bet there were some. My parents' LP collection, the Everly Brothers, all these things from my youth.
Thank you so much for taking time to share a little bit about your history with Beauty and the Beast and your career. It's just so amazing to get to hear from you. You really are one of the great legends of our industry, and it's just been my honor to get to talk to you today.